beginning, and he had found one of the first most luminous daughters of men. She traced with her hands the line of his loins and thighs at the back, and a living fire ran through her, from him, darkly. It was a dark flood of electric passion she released from him, drew into herself. She had established a rich new circuit, a new current of passional electric energy between the two of them, released from the darkest poles of the body and established in perfect circuit. It was a dark fire of electricity that rushed from him to her and flooded them both with rich peace, satisfaction. "My love," she cried, lifting her face to him, her eyes, her mouth open in transport. "My love," he answered, bending and kissing her, always kissing her. She closed her hands over the full, rounded body of his loins. As he stooped over her, she seemed to touch the quick of the mystery of darkness that was bodily him. She seemed to faint beneath, and he seemed to faint, stooping over her. It was a perfect passing away for both of them, and at the same time the most intolerable accession into being, the marvelous fullness of immediate gratification, overwhelming, outflooding from the source of the deepest life force, the darkest, deepest, strangest life source of the human body, at the back and base of the loins. After a lapse of stillness, after the rivers of strange dark fluid richness had passed over her, flooding, carrying away her mind and flooding down her spine and down her knees, past her feet, a strange flood, sweeping away everything and leaving her an essential new being, she was left quite free. She was free in complete ease, her complete self. So she rose, stilly and blithe, smiling at him. He stood before her, glimmering, so awfully real, that her heart almost stopped beating. He stood there in his strange, whole body that had its marvelous fountains, like the bodies of the sons of God, who were in the beginning. There were strange fountains of his body, more mysterious and potent than any she had imagined or known, more satisfying, finally, mystically physically satisfying. She had thought there was no source deeper than the phallic source. And now, behold, from the smitten rock of the man's body, from the strange, marvelous flanks and thighs, deeper, further in mystery than the phallic source, came the floods of ineffable darkness and ineffable riches. They were glad, and they could forget perfectly. They laughed, and went to the meal provided. There was a venison pasty, of all things, a large broad-faced cut ham, eggs and cresses and red beetroot, and medlars and apple tart, and tea. "What good things," she cried with pleasure. "How noble it looks. Shall I pour out the tea?" She was usually nervous and uncertain at performing these public duties, such as giving tea. But today she forgot. She was at her ease, entirely forgetting to have misgivings. The teapot poured beautifully from a proud, slender spout. Her eyes were warm with smiles as she gave him his tea. She had learned at last to be still and perfect. "Everything is ours," she said to him. "Everything," he answered. She gave a queer little crowing sound of triumph. "I'm so glad," she cried, with unspeakable relief. "So am I," he said, "but I'm thinking we'd better get out of our responsibilities as quick as we can." "What responsibilities?" she asked, wondering. "We must drop our jobs, like a shot." A new understanding dawned into her face. "Of course," she said, "there's that." "We must get out," he said. "There's nothing for it but to get out quick." She looked at him doubtfully across the table. "But where?" she said. "I don't know," he said. "We'll just wander about for a bit." Again she looked at him quizzically. "I should be perfectly happy at the mill," she said. "It's very near the old thing," he said. "Let us wander a bit." His voice could be so soft and happy-go-lucky. It went through her veins like an exhilaration. Nevertheless, she dreamed of a valley and wild gardens and peace. She had a desire, too, for splendor, an aristocratic, extravagant splendor. Wandering seemed to her like restlessness, dissatisfaction. "Where will you wander to?" she asked. "I don't know. I feel as if I would just meet you, and we'd set off, just towards the distance." "But where can one go?" she asked anxiously. "After all, there's only the world, and none of it is very distant." "Still," he said, "I should like to go with you nowhere." It would be rather wandering just to nowhere. That's the place to get to nowhere. One wants to wander away from the world somewheres, into our own nowhere.
Still she meditated.
You see, my love, she said, I'm so afraid that while we are only people, we've got to take the world that's given, because there isn't any other. Yes, there is, he said. There's somewhere where we can be free, somewhere where one needn't wear much clothes, none even, where one meets a few people who have gone through enough, and can take things for granted, where you be yourself without bothering. There is somewhere there are one or two people. But where? She sighed. Somewhere, anywhere. Let's wander off. That's the thing to do. Let's wander off. Yes, she said, thrilled at the thought of travel. But to her it was only travel.
To be free, he said.
To be free in a free place with a few other people. Yes, she said wistfully. Those few other people depressed her. It isn't really a locality though, he said. It's a perfected relation between you and me and others, the perfect relation, so that we are free together. It is, my love, isn't it, she said. It's you and me. It's you and me, isn't it? She stretched out her arms to him. He went across and stooped to kiss her face. Her arms closed round him again, her hands spread upon his shoulders, moving slowly there, moving slowly on his back, down his back slowly, with a strange recurrent, rhythmic motion, yet moving slowly down, pressing mysteriously over his loins, over his flanks. The sense of the awfulness of riches that could never be impaired flooded her mind like a swoon, a death in most marvelous possession, mystic sure. She possessed him so utterly and intolerably that she herself lapsed out, and yet she was only sitting still in the chair, with her hands pressed upon him, and lost. Again, he softly kissed her. We shall never go apart again, he murmured quietly, and she did not speak, but only pressed her hands firmer down upon the source of darkness in him. They decided, when they woke again from the pure swoon, to write their resignations from the world of work there and then.
She wanted this.
He rang the bell and ordered notepaper without a printed address. The waiter cleared the table. Now then, he said, yours first. Put your home address and the date, then Director of Education, Town Hall, sir. Now then, I don't know how one really stands. I suppose one could get out of it in less than a month. Anyhow, sir, I beg to resign my post as class mistress in the Wiley Green Grammar School. I should be very grateful if you would liberate me as soon as possible, without waiting for the expiration of the month's notice. That'll do. Have you got it? Let me look. Ursula Brangwen. Good. Now I'll write mine. I ought to give them 3 months, but I can plead health. I can arrange it all right. He sat and wrote out his formal resignation. Now, he said, when the envelopes were sealed and addressed, shall we post them here, both together? I know Jackie will say, here's a coincidence, when he receives them in all their identity. Shall we let him say it, or not? I don't care, she said. No, he said, pondering. It doesn't matter, does it? She said. Yes, he replied. Their imaginations shall not work on us. I'll post yours here, mine after. I cannot be implicated in their imaginings. He looked at her with his strange, non-human singleness. Yes, you are right, she said. She lifted her face to him, all shining and open. It was as if he might enter straight into the source of her radiance. His face became a little distracted. Shall we go? He said. As you like, she replied. They were soon out of the little town and running through the uneven lanes of the country. Ursula nestled near him, into his constant warmth, and watched the pale-lit revelation racing ahead, the visible night. Sometimes it was a wide old road, with grass spaces on either side, flying magic and elfin in the greenish illumination. Sometimes it was trees looming overhead. Sometimes it was bramble bushes. Sometimes the walls of a crew yard and the butt of a barn. Are you going to Shortlands to dinner? Ursula asked him suddenly. He started. Good God, he said. Shortlands. Never again. Not that. Besides, we should be too late. Where are we going then? To the mill? If you like. Pity to go anywhere on this good, dark night. Pity to come out of it, really. Pity we can't stop in the good darkness. It is better than anything ever would be this good, immediate darkness. She sat wondering. The car lurched and swayed. She knew there was no leaving him. The darkness held them both and contained them. It was not to be surpassed. Besides, she had a full mystic knowledge of his suave loins of darkness, dark-clad and suave, and in this knowledge there was some of the inevitability and the beauty of fate, fate which one asks for, which one accepts in full. He sat still like an Egyptian pharaoh, driving the car. He felt as if he were seated in immemorial potency, like the great carven statues of real Egypt, as real and as fulfilled with subtle strength as these are, with a vague, inscrutable smile on the lips. He knew what it was to have the strange and magical current of force in his back and loins, and down his legs, force so perfect that it stayed him immobile and left his face subtly, mindlessly smiling. He knew what it was to be awake and potent in that other basic mind, the deepest physical mind. And from this source he had a pure and magic control, magical, mystical, a force in darkness, like electricity. It was very difficult to speak. It was so perfect to sit in this pure living silence, subtle, full of unthinkable knowledge and unthinkable force, upheld immemorially in timeless force, like the immobile, supremely potent Egyptians, seated forever in their living, subtle silence. "We need not go home," he said. "This car has seats that let down and make a bed, and we can lift the hood." She was glad and frightened. She cowered near to him. "But what about them at home?" she said. "Send a telegram." Nothing more was said. They ran on in silence. But with a sort of second consciousness, he steered the car towards a destination. For he had the free intelligence to direct his own ends. His arms and his breast and his head were rounded and living like those of the Greek. He had not the unawakened straight arms of the Egyptian, nor the sealed, slumbering head. A lambent intelligence played secondarily above his pure Egyptian concentration in darkness. They came to a village that lined along the road. The car crept slowly along until he saw the post office. Then he pulled up. "I will send a telegram to your father," he said. "I will merely say, spending the night in town, shall I?" "Yes," she answered. She did not want to be disturbed into taking thought. She watched him move into the post office. It was also a shop she saw. Strange he was. Even as he went into the lighted, public place, he remained dark and magic. The living silence seemed the body of reality in him, subtle, potent, indiscoverable. There he was. In a strange uplift of elation she saw him, the being never to be revealed, awful in its potency, mystic and real. This dark, subtle reality of him, never to be translated, liberated her into perfection, her own perfected being. She too was dark and fulfilled in silence. He came out, throwing some packages into the car. "There is some bread and cheese and raisins and apples and hard chocolate," he said, in his voice that was as if laughing, because of the unblemished stillness and force which was the reality in him. She would have to touch him. To speak, to see, was nothing. It was a travesty to look and to comprehend the man there. Darkness and silence must fall perfectly on her, then she could know mystically, in unrevealed touch. She must lightly, mindlessly connect with him, have the knowledge which is death of knowledge, the reality of surety in not knowing. Soon they had run on again into the darkness. She did not ask where they were going, she did not care. She sat in a fullness and a pure potency that was like apathy, mindless and immobile. She was next to him, and hung in a pure rest, as a star is hung, balanced unthinkably. Still there remained a dark lambency of anticipation. She would touch him. With perfect fine fingertips of reality, she would touch the reality in him, the suave, pure, untranslatable reality of his loins of darkness. To touch, mindlessly in darkness, to come in pure touching upon the living reality of him, his suave, perfect loins and thighs of darkness. This was her sustaining anticipation. And he too waited in the magical steadfastness of suspense for her to take this knowledge of him as he had taken it of her. He knew her darkly, with the fullness of dark knowledge. Now she would know him, and he too would be liberated. He would be night-free, like an Egyptian, steadfast in perfectly suspended equilibrium, pure mystic nodality of physical being. They would give each other this star equilibrium, which alone is freedom. She saw that they were running among trees, great old trees with dying bracken undergrowth. The palish, gnarled trunks showed ghostly, and like old priests in the hovering distance, the fern rose magical and mysterious. It was a night all darkness, with low cloud. The motor car advanced slowly. "Where are we?" she whispered. "In Sherwood Forest." It was evident he knew the place. He drove softly, watching. Then they came to a green road between the trees. They turned cautiously round, and were advancing between the oaks of the forest, down a green lane. The green lane widened into a little circle of grass, where there was a small trickle of water at the bottom of a sloping bank. The car stopped. "We will stay here," he said, "and put out the lights." He extinguished the lamps at once, and it was pure night, with shadows of trees like realities of other, nightly being. He threw a rug onto the bracken, and they sat in stillness and mindless silence. There were faint sounds from the wood, but no disturbance, no possible disturbance. The world was under a strange ban. A new mystery had supervened. They threw off their clothes, and he gathered her to him, and found the pure lambent reality of her forever invisible flesh. Quenched inhuman, his fingers upon her unrevealed nudity were the fingers of silence upon silence, the body of mysterious night upon the body of mysterious night, the night masculine and feminine, never to be seen with the eye or known with the mind, only known as a palpable revelation of living otherness. She had her desire of him. She touched. She received the maximum of unspeakable communication in touch, dark, subtle, positively silent, a magnificent gift and give again, a perfect acceptance and yielding, a mystery, the reality of that which can never be known, vital, sensual reality that can never be transmuted into mind content, but remains outside, living body of darkness and silence and subtlety, the mystic body of reality. She had her desire fulfilled. He had his desire fulfilled, for she was to him what he was to her, the immemorial magnificence of mystic, palpable, real otherness. They slept the chilly night through under the hood of the car, a night of unbroken sleep. It was already high day when he awoke. They looked at each other and laughed, then looked away, filled with darkness and secrecy. Then they kissed and remembered the magnificence of the night. It was so magnificent, such an inheritance of a universe of dark reality, that they were afraid to seem to remember. They hid away the remembrance and the knowledge.
Ziv.
Death and love. Thomas Critch died slowly, terribly slowly. It seemed impossible to everybody that the thread of life could be drawn out so thin, and yet not break. The sick man lay unutterably weak and spent, kept alive by morphia and by drinks, which he sipped slowly. He was only half conscious, a thin strand of consciousness linking the darkness of death with the light of day. Yet his will was unbroken. He was integral, complete. Only he must have perfect stillness about him. Any presence but that of the nurses was a strain and an effort to him now. Every morning Gerald went into the room, hoping to find his father passed away at last. Yet always he saw the same transparent face, the same dread dark hair on the waxen forehead, and the awful, inchoate dark eyes, which seemed to be decomposing into formless darkness, having only a tiny grain of vision within them. And always, as the dark, inchoate eyes turned to him, there passed through Gerald's bowels a burning stroke of revolt that seemed to resound through his whole being, threatening to break his mind with its clangor and making him mad. Every morning, the sun stood there, erect and taut with life, gleaming in his blondness. The gleaming blondness of a strange, imminent being put the father into a fever of fretful irritation. He could not bear to meet the uncanny, downward look of Gerald's blue eyes. But it was only for a moment. Each on the brink of departure, the father and son looked at each other, then parted. For a long time Gerald preserved a perfect sang-froid. He remained quite collected. But at last, fear undermined him. He was afraid of some horrible collapse in himself. He had to stay and see this thing through. Some perverse will made him watch his father drawn over the borders of life. And yet, now, every day, the great red-hot stroke of horrified fear through the bowels of the sun struck a further inflammation. Gerald went about all day with a tendency to cringe, as if there were the point of a sword of Damocles pricking the nape of his neck. There was no escape. He was bound up with his father. He had to see him through. And the father's will never relaxed or yielded to death. It would have to snap when death at last snapped it, if it did not persist after a physical death. In the same way, the will of the son never yielded. He stood firm and immune. He was outside this death and this dying. It was a trial by ordeal. Could he stand and see his father slowly dissolve and disappear in death, without once yielding his will, without once relenting before the omnipotence of death? Like a red Indian undergoing torture, Gerald would experience the whole process of slow death without wincing or flinching. He even triumphed in it. He somehow wanted this death, even forced it. It was as if he himself were dealing the death, even when he most recoiled in horror. Still, he would deal it. He would triumph through death. But in the stress of this ordeal, Gerald too lost his hold on the outer, daily life. That which was much to him came to mean nothing. Work, pleasure, it was all left behind. He went on more or less mechanically with his business, but this activity was all extraneous. The real activity was this ghastly wrestling for death in his own soul. And his own will should triumph. Come what might, he would not bow down or submit or acknowledge a master. He had no master in death. But as the fight went on, and all that he had been and was continued to be destroyed, so that life was a hollow shell all round him, roaring and clattering like the sound of the sea, a noise in which he participated externally, and inside this hollow shell was all the darkness and fearful space of death. He knew he would have to find reinforcements, otherwise he would collapse inwards upon the great dark void which circled at the center of his soul. His will held his outer life, his outer mind, his outer being unbroken and unchanged. But the pressure was too great. He would have to find something to make good the equilibrium. Something must come with him into the hollow void of death in his soul, fill it up, and so equalize the pressure within to the pressure without. For day by day he felt more and more like a bubble filled with darkness, round which whirled the iridescence of his consciousness, and upon which the pressure of the outer world, the outer life, roared vastly. In this extremity, his instinct led him to Gudrun. He threw away everything now. He only wanted the relation established with her. He would follow her to the studio, to be near her, to talk to her. He would stand about the room, aimlessly picking up the implements, the lumps of clay, the little figures she had cast. They were whimsical and grotesque, looking at them without perceiving them. And she felt him following her, dogging her heels like a doom. She held away from him, and yet she knew he drew always a little nearer, a little nearer. "I say," he said to her one evening, in an odd, unthinking, uncertain way, "won't you stay to dinner tonight? I wish you would." She started slightly. He spoke to her like a man making a request of another man. "They'll be expecting me at home," she said. "Oh, they won't mind, will they?" he said. "I should be awfully glad if you'd stay." Her long silence gave consent at last. "I'll tell Thomas, shall I?" he said. "I must go almost immediately after dinner," she said. It was a dark, cold evening. There was no fire in the drawing room. They sat in the library. He was mostly silent, absent, and Winifred talked little. But when Gerald did rouse himself, he smiled and was pleasant and ordinary with her. Then there came over him again the long blanks, of which he was not aware. She was very much attracted by him. He looked so preoccupied, and his strange, blank silences, which she could not read, moved her and made her wonder over him, made her feel reverential towards him. But he was very kind. He gave her the best things at the table. He had a bottle of slightly sweet, delicious golden wine brought out for dinner, knowing she would prefer it to the Burgundy. She felt herself esteemed, needed almost. As they took coffee in the library, there was a soft, very soft knocking at the door. He started and called, "Come in." The timbre of his voice, like something vibrating at high pitch, unnerved Gudrun. A nurse in white entered, half hovering in the doorway like a shadow. She was very good-looking, but strangely enough, shy and self-mistrusting. "The doctor would like to speak to you, Mr. Critch," she said in her low, discreet voice. "The doctor," he said, starting up. "Where is he?" "He is in the dining room. Tell him I'm coming." He drank up his coffee and followed the nurse, who had dissolved like a shadow. "Which nurse was that?" asked Gudrun. "Miss Inglis. I like her best," replied Winifred. After a while, Gerald came back, looking absorbed by his own thoughts, and having some of that tension and abstraction which is seen in a slightly drunken man. He did not say what the doctor had wanted him for, but stood before the fire, with his hands behind his back, and his face open and as if rapt. Not that he was really thinking, he was only arrested in pure suspense inside himself, and thoughts wafted through his mind without order. "I must go now and see Mama," said Winifred, "and see Dada before he goes to sleep." She bade them both good night. Gudrun also rose to take her leave. "You needn't go yet, need you?" said Gerald, glancing quickly at the clock. "It is early yet. I'll walk down with you when you go. Sit down. Don't hurry away." Gudrun sat down, as if, absent as he was, his will had power over her. She felt almost mesmerized. He was strange to her, something unknown. What was he thinking? What was he feeling? As he stood there so rapt, saying nothing. He kept her. She could feel that. He would not let her go. She watched him in humble submissiveness. "Had the doctor anything new to tell you?" she asked, softly, at length, with that gentle, timid sympathy which touched a keen fiber in his heart. He lifted his eyebrows with a negligent, indifferent expression. "No, nothing new," he replied, as if the question were quite casual, trivial. "He says the pulse is very weak indeed, very intermittent, but that doesn't necessarily mean much, you know." He looked down at her. Her eyes were dark and soft and unfolded, with a stricken look that roused him. "No," she murmured at length. "I don't understand anything about these things."
"Just as well not," he said.
"I say, won't you have a cigarette?"
"Do."
He quickly fetched the box and held her a light. Then he stood before her on the hearth again. "No," he said, "we've never had much illness in the house, either. Not till father." He seemed to meditate a while. Then, looking down at her, with strangely communicative blue eyes that filled her with dread, he continued, "It's something you don't reckon with, you know, till it is there. And then you realize that it was there all the time, it was always there, you understand what I mean? The possibility of this incurable illness, this slow death." He moved his feet uneasily on the marble hearth and put his cigarette to his mouth, looking up at the ceiling. "I know," murmured Gudrun. "It is dreadful." He smoked without knowing. Then he took the cigarette from his lips, bared his teeth, and putting the tip of his tongue between his teeth spat off a grain of tobacco, turning slightly aside, like a man who is alone, or who is lost in thought. "I don't know what the effect actually is on one," he said, and again he looked down at her. Her eyes were dark and stricken with knowledge, looking into his. He saw her submerged, and he turned aside his face. "But I absolutely am not the same. There's nothing left, if you understand what I mean. You seem to be clutching at the void, and at the same time you are void yourself, and so you don't know what to do." "No," she murmured. A heavy thrill ran down her nerves, heavy, almost pleasure, almost pain. "What can be done?" she added. He turned and flipped the ash from his cigarette onto the great marble hearthstones that lay bare in the room, without fender or bar. "I don't know, I'm sure," he replied. "But I do think you've got to find some way of resolving the situation. Not because you want to, but because you've got to, otherwise you're done. The whole of everything, and yourself included, is just on the point of caving in, and you're just holding it up with your hands. Well, it's a situation that obviously can't continue. You can't stand holding the roof up with your hands forever. You know that sooner or later you'll have to let go. Do you understand what I mean? And so something's got to be done, or there's a universal collapse, as far as you yourself are concerned." He shifted slightly on the hearth, crunching a cinder under his heel. He looked down at it. Gudrun was aware of the beautiful old marble panels of the fireplace, swelling softly carved, round him and above him. She felt as if she were caught at last by fate, imprisoned in some horrible and fatal trap. But what can be done? She murmured humbly. You must use me if I can be of any help at all. But how can I? I don't see how I can help you. He looked down at her critically. I don't want you to help, he said, slightly irritated, because there's nothing to be done. I only want sympathy, do you see? I want somebody I can talk to sympathetically. That eases the strain. And there is nobody to talk to sympathetically. That's the curious thing. There is nobody. There's Rupert Birkin. But then he isn't sympathetic, he wants to dictate. And that is no use whatsoever. She was caught in a strange snare. She looked down at her hands. Then there was the sound of the door softly opening. Gerald started. He was chagrined. It was his starting that really startled Gudrun. Then he went forward with quick, graceful, intentional courtesy. Oh, Mother, he said. How nice of you to come down. How are you? The elderly woman, loosely and bulkily wrapped in a purple gown, came forward silently, slightly hulkied, as usual. Her son was at her side. He pushed her up a chair, saying, You know Miss Brangwen, don't you? The mother glanced at Gudrun indifferently. Yes, she said. Then she turned her wonderful, forget-me-not blue eyes up to her son, as she slowly sat down in the chair he had brought her. I came to ask you about your father, she said, in her rapid, scarcely audible voice. I didn't know you had company.
No?
Didn't Winifred tell you? Miss Brangwen stayed to dinner, to make us a little more lively. Mrs. Critch turned slowly round to Gudrun and looked at her, but with unseeing eyes. I'm afraid it would be no treat to her. Then she turned again to her son. Winifred tells me the doctor had something to say about your father. What is it? Only that the pulse is very weak. Misses altogether a good many times, so that he might not last the night out, Gerald replied. Mrs. Critch sat perfectly impassive, as if she had not heard. Her bulk seemed hunched in the chair. Her fair hair hung slack over her ears. But her skin was clear and fine. Her hands, as she sat with them forgotten and folded, were quite beautiful, full of potential energy. A great mass of energy seemed decaying up in that silent, hulking form. She looked up at her son, as he stood, keen and soldierly, near to her. Her eyes were most wonderfully blue, bluer than forget-nots. She seemed to have a certain confidence in Gerald, and to feel a certain motherly mistrust of him. How are you? She muttered, in her strangely quiet voice, as if nobody should hear but him. You're not getting into a state, are you? You're not letting it make you hysterical? The curious challenge in the last words startled Gudrun. I don't think so, Mother, he answered, rather coldly cheery. Somebody's got to see it through, you know. Have they? Have they? Answered his mother rapidly. Why should you take it on yourself? What have you got to do? Seeing it through. It will see itself through. You are not needed. No, I don't suppose I can do any good, he answered. It's just how it affects us, you see. You like to be affected, don't you? It's quite nuts for you. You would have to be important. You have no need to stop at home. Why don't you go away? These sentences, evidently the ripened grain of many dark hours, took Gerald by surprise. I don't think it's any good going away now, Mother, at the last minute, he said coldly. You take care, replied his mother. You mind yourself, that's your business. You take too much on yourself. You mind yourself, or you'll find yourself in Queer Street. That's what will happen to you. You're hysterical, always were. I'm all right, Mother, he said. There's no need to worry about me, I assure you. Let the dead bury their dead. Don't go and bury yourself along with them. That's what I tell you. I know you well enough. He did not answer this, not knowing what to say. The mother sat bunched up in silence, her beautiful white hands, that had no rings whatsoever, clasping the pommels of her armchair. You can't do it, she said, almost bitterly. You haven't the nerve. You're as weak as a cat really always were. Is this young woman staying here? No, said Gerald. She is going home tonight. Then she'd better have the dog cart. Does she go far? Only to Beldover. Ah. The elderly woman never looked at Gudrun, yet she seemed to take knowledge of her presence. You are inclined to take too much on yourself, Gerald, said the mother, pulling herself to her feet with a little difficulty. Will you go, Mother? He asked politely. Yes, I'll go up again, she replied. Turning to Gudrun, she bade her good night. Then she went slowly to the door, as if she were unaccustomed to walking. At the door, she lifted her face to him implicitly. He kissed her. Don't come any further with me, she said, in her barely audible voice. I don't want you any further. He bade her good night, watched her across to the stairs and mount slowly. Then he closed the door and came back to Gudrun. Gudrun rose also, to go. A queer being, my mother, he said. Yes, replied Gudrun. She has her own thoughts. Yes, said Gudrun. Then they were silent. You want to go? He asked. Half a minute. I'll just have a horse put in. No, said Gudrun. I want to walk. He had promised to walk with her down the long, lonely mile of drive, and she wanted this. You might just as well drive, he said. I'd much rather walk, she asserted with emphasis. You would? Then I will come along with you. You know where your things are? I'll put boots on. He put on a cap and an overcoat over his evening dress. They went out into the night. Let us light a cigarette, he said, stopping in a sheltered angle of the porch. You have one too. So, with the scent of tobacco on the night air, they set off down the dark drive that ran between close-cut hedges through sloping meadows. He wanted to put his arm round her. If he could put his arm round her and draw her against him as they walked, he would equilibrate himself. For now he felt like a pair of scales, the half of which tips down and down into an indefinite void. He must recover some sort of balance. And here was the hope and the perfect recovery. Blind to her, thinking only of himself, he slipped his arm softly round her waist and drew her to him. Her heart fainted, feeling herself taken. But then, his arm was so strong, she quailed under its powerful close grasp. She died a little death and was drawn against him as they walked down the stormy darkness. He seemed to balance her perfectly in opposition to himself, in their dual motion of walking. So, suddenly, he was liberated and perfect, strong, heroic. He put his hand to his mouth and threw his cigarette away, a gleaming point, into the unseen hedge. Then he was quite free to balance her. That's better, he said, with exultancy. The exultation in his voice was like a sweetish, poisonous drug to her. Did she then mean so much to him? She sipped the poison. Are you happier? She asked wistfully. Much better, he said, in the same exultant voice, and I was rather far gone. She nestled against him. He felt her all soft and warm. She was the rich, lovely substance of his being. The warmth and motion of her walk suffused through him wonderfully. I'm so glad if I help you, she said. Yes, he answered. There's nobody else could do it if you wouldn't. That is true, she said to herself, with a thrill of strange, fatal elation. As they walked, he seemed to lift her nearer and nearer to himself, till she moved upon the firm vehicle of his body. He was so strong, so sustaining, and he could not be opposed. She drifted along in a wonderful interfusion of physical motion, down the dark, blowy hillside. Far across shone the little yellow lights of Beldover, many of them spread in a thick patch on another dark hill. But he and she were walking in perfect, isolated darkness outside the world. But how much do you care for me? Came her voice, almost querulous. You see, I don't know, I don't understand. How much? His voice rang with a painful elation. I don't know either, but everything. He was startled by his own declaration. It was true. So he stripped himself of every safeguard in making this admission to her. He cared everything for her. She was everything. But I can't believe it, said her low voice, amazed, trembling. She was trembling with doubt and exultance. This was the thing she wanted to hear, only this. Yet now she heard it, heard the strange clapping vibration of truth in his voice as he said it. She could not believe. She could not believe. She did not believe. Yet she believed, triumphantly, with fatal exultance. Why not? He said. Why don't you believe it? It's true. It is true, as we stand at this moment. He stood still with her in the wind. I care for nothing on earth, or in heaven, outside this spot where we are. And it isn't my own presence I care about. It is all yours. I'd sell my soul 100 times, but I couldn't bear not to have you here. I couldn't bear to be alone. My brain would burst. It is true." He drew her closer to him, with definite movement. "No," she murmured, afraid. Yet this was what she wanted. Why did she so lose courage? They resumed their strange walk. They were such strangers, and yet they were so frightfully, unthinkably near. It was like a madness. Yet it was what she wanted. It was what she wanted. They had descended the hill, and now they were coming to the square arch where the road passed under the colliery railway. The arch, Gudrun knew, had walls of squared stone, mossy on one side with water that trickled down, dry on the other side. She had stood under it to hear the train rumble thundering over the logs overhead. And she knew that under this dark and lonely bridge the young colliers stood in the darkness with their sweethearts in rainy weather. And so she wanted to stand under the bridge with her sweetheart and be kissed under the bridge in the invisible darkness. Her steps dragged as she drew near. So, under the bridge, they came to a standstill, and he lifted her upon his breast. His body vibrated taut and powerful as he closed upon her and crushed her, breathless and dazed and destroyed, crushed her upon his breast. It was terrible and perfect. Under this bridge, the colliers pressed their lovers to their breast. And now, under the bridge, the master of them all pressed her to himself. And how much more powerful and terrible was his embrace than theirs, how much more concentrated and supreme his love was than theirs in the same sort. She felt she would swoon, die, under the vibrating, inhuman tension of his arms and his body. She would pass away. Then the unthinkable high vibration slackened and became more undulating. He slackened and drew her with him to stand with his back to the wall. She was almost unconscious. So the colliers' lovers would stand with their backs to the walls, holding their sweethearts and kissing them as she was being kissed. But would their kisses be fine and powerful as the kisses of the firm-mouthed master? Even the keen, short-cut mustache, the colliers would not have that. And the colliers' sweethearts would, like herself, hang their heads back limp over their shoulder and look out from the dark archway at the close patch of yellow lights on the unseen hill in the distance, or at the vague form of trees and at the buildings of the colliery woodyard. In the other direction, his arms were fast around her. He seemed to be gathering her into himself, her warmth, her softness, her adorable weight, drinking in the suffusion of her physical being avidly. He lifted her and seemed to pour her into himself, like wine into a cup. "This is worth everything," he said, in a strange, penetrating voice. So she relaxed and seemed to melt, to flow into him, as if she were some infinitely warm and precious suffusion filling into his veins, like an intoxicant. Her arms were round his neck. He kissed her and held her perfectly suspended. She was all slack and flowing into him, and he was the firm, strong cup that receives the wine of her life. So she lay cast upon him, stranded, lifted up against him, melting and melting under his kisses, melting into his limbs and bones, as if he were soft iron becoming surcharged with her electric life, till she seemed to swoon. Gradually her mind went, and she passed away. Everything in her was melted down and fluid, and she lay still, become contained by him, sleeping in him as lightning sleeps in a pure, soft stone. So she was passed away and gone in him, and he was perfected. When she opened her eyes again and saw the patch of lights in the distance, it seemed to her strange that the world still existed, that she was standing under the bridge resting her head on Gerald's breast. Gerald, who was he? He was the exquisite adventure, the desirable unknown to her. She looked up, and in the darkness saw his face above her, his shapely, male face. There seemed a faint, white light emitted from him, a white aura, as if he were visitor from the unseen. She reached up, like Eve reaching to the apples on the tree of knowledge, and she kissed him, though her passion was a transcendent fear of the thing he was, touching his face with her infinitely delicate, encroaching, wondering fingers. Her fingers went over the mold of his face, over his features. How perfect and foreign he was, how dangerous. Her soul thrilled with complete knowledge. This was the glistening, forbidden apple. this face of a man. She kissed him, putting her fingers over his face, his eyes, his nostrils, over his brows and his ears, to his neck, to know him, to gather him in by touch. He was so firm and shapely, with such satisfying, inconceivable shapeliness, strange, yet unutterably clear. He was such an unutterable enemy, yet glistening with uncanny white fire. She wanted to touch him and touch him and touch him, till she had him all in her hands, till she had strained him into her knowledge. Ah, if she could have the precious knowledge of him, she would be filled, and nothing could deprive her of this. For he was so unsure, so risky in the common world of day. "You are so beautiful," she murmured in her throat. He wondered and was suspended, but she felt him quiver, and she came down involuntarily nearer upon him. He could not help himself. Her fingers had him under their power. The fathomless desire they could evoke in him was deeper than death, where he had no choice. But she knew now, and it was enough. For the time, her soul was destroyed with the exquisite shock of his invisible fluid lightning. She knew, and this knowledge was a death from which she must recover. How much more of him was there to know? Ah, much, much. Many days harvesting for her large, yet perfectly subtle and intelligent hands upon the field of his living, radioactive body. Ah, her hands were eager, greedy for knowledge. But for the present it was enough. Enough, as much as her soul could bear. Too much, and she would shatter herself. She would fill the fine vial of her soul too quickly, and it would break. Enough now, enough for the time being. There were all the after days when her hands, like birds, could feed upon the fields of him mystical plastic form. Till then enough. And even he was glad to be checked, rebuked, held back. For to desire is better than to possess. The finality of the end was dreaded as deeply as it was desired. They walked on towards the town, towards where the lamps threaded singly, at long intervals down the dark highroad of the valley. They came at length to the gate of the drive. "Don't come any further," she said. "You'd rather I didn't?" he asked, relieved. He did not want to go up the public streets with her, his soul all naked and alight as it was. Much rather, good night. She held out her hand. He grasped it, then touched the perilous, potent fingers with his lips. "Good night," he said. "Tomorrow." And they parted. He went home full of the strength and the power of living desire. But the next day, she did not come. She sent a note that she was kept indoors by a cold. Here was a torment, but he possessed his soul in some sort of patience, writing a brief answer, telling her how sorry he was not to see her. The day after this, he stayed at home. It seemed so futile to go down to the office. His father could not live the week out, and he wanted to be at home, suspended. Gerald sat on a chair by the window in his father's room. The landscape outside was black and winter-sodden. His father lay gray and ashen on the bed. A nurse moved silently in her white dress, neat and elegant, even beautiful. There was a scent of eau de cologne in the room. The nurse went out of the room. Gerald was alone with death, facing the winter-black landscape. "Is there much more water in Denley?" came the faint voice, determined and querulous, from the bed. The dying man was asking about a leakage from wily water into one of the pits. "Some more. We shall have to run off the lake," said Gerald. "Will you?" The faint voice filtered to extinction. There was dead stillness. The gray-faced, sick man lay with eyes closed, more dead than death. Gerald looked away. He felt his heart was seared. It would perish if this went on much longer. Suddenly, he heard a strange noise. Turning round, he saw his father's eyes wide open, strained and rolling in a frenzy of inhuman struggling. Gerald started to his feet and stood transfixed in horror. "Yhh!" came a horrible choking rattle from his father's throat, the fearful, frenzied eye, rolling awfully in its wild, fruitless search for help, passed blindly over Gerald. Then up came the dark blood and mess pumping over the face of the agonized being. The tense body relaxed. The head fell aside, down the pillow. Gerald stood transfixed, his soul echoing in horror. He would move, but he could not. He could not move his limbs. His brain seemed to re-echo, like a pulse. The nurse in white softly entered. She glanced at Gerald, then at the bed. "Ah," came her soft whimpering cry, and she hurried forward to the dead man. "Aich," came the slight sound of her agitated distress as she stood bending over the bedside. Then she recovered, turned, and came for towel and sponge. She was wiping the dead face carefully and murmuring, almost whimpering, very softly, "Poor Mr. Critch, poor Mr. Critch, poor Mr. Critch. Is he dead?" clanged Gerald's sharp voice. "Oh yes, he's gone," replied the soft, moaning voice of the nurse as she looked up at Gerald's face. She was young and beautiful and quivering. A strange sort of grin went over Gerald's face, over the horror, and he walked out of the room. He was going to tell his mother. On the landing, he met his brother Basil. "He's gone, Basil," he said, scarcely able to subdue his voice, not to let an unconscious, frightening exultation sound through. "What?" cried Basil, going pale. Gerald nodded. Then he went on to his mother's room. She was sitting in her purple gown, sewing, very slowly sewing, putting in a stitch, then another stitch. She looked up at Gerald with her blue, undaunted eyes.
"Father's gone," he said.
"He's dead? Who says so?" "Oh, you know, Mother, if you see him." She put her sewing down and slowly rose. "Are you going to see him?" he asked. "Yes," she said. By the bedside, the children already stood in a weeping group. "Oh, Mother," cried the daughters, almost in hysterics, weeping loudly. But the mother went forward. The dead man lay in repose, as if gently asleep, so gently, so peacefully, like a young man sleeping in purity. He was still warm. She stood looking at him in gloomy, heavy silence for some time. She said bitterly, at length, speaking as if to the unseen witnesses of the air. "You're dead." She stood for some minutes in silence, looking down. "Beautiful," she asserted. "Beautiful as if life had never touched you. Never touched you. God send I look different. I hope I shall look my years, when I am dead. Beautiful, beautiful," she crooned over him. You can see him in his teens, with his first beard on his face. A beautiful soul, beautiful. Then there was a tearing in her voice as she cried, "None of you look like this. When you are dead, don't let it happen again." It was a strange, wild command from out of the unknown. Her children moved unconsciously together, in a nearer group, at the dreadful command in her voice. The color was flushed bright in her cheek. She looked awful and wonderful. Blame me if you like, that he lies there like a lad in his teens, with his first beard on his face. Blame me if you like, but you none of you know. She was silent in intense silence. Then there came, in a low, tense voice, "If I thought that the children I bore would lie looking like that in death, I'd strangle them when they were infants. Yes." "No, Mother," came the strange, clarion voice of Gerald from the background. "We are different. We don't blame you." She turned and looked full in his eyes. Then she lifted her hands in a strange half gesture of mad despair. "Pray," she said strongly. "Pray for yourselves to God, for there's no help for you from your parents." "Oh, Mother," cried her daughters wildly. But she had turned and gone, and they all went quickly away from each other. When Gudrun heard that Mr. Critch was dead, she felt rebuked. She had stayed away lest Gerald should think her too easy of winning. And now, he was in the midst of trouble, whilst she was cold. The following day she went up as usual to Winifred, who was glad to see her, glad to get away into the studio. The girl had wept, and then, too frightened, had turned aside to avoid any more tragic eventuality. She and Gudrun resumed work as usual, in the isolation of the studio, and this seemed an immeasurable happiness, a pure world of freedom, after the aimlessness and misery of the house. Gudrun stayed until evening. She and Winifred had dinner brought up to the studio, where they ate in freedom, away from all the people in the house. After dinner, Gerald came up. The great high studio was full of shadow and a fragrance of coffee. Gudrun and Winifred had a little table near the fire at the far end, with a white lamp whose light did not travel far. They were a tiny world to themselves, the two girls surrounded by lovely shadows, the beams and rafters shadowy overhead, the benches and implements shadowy down the studio. "You are cozy enough here," said Gerald, going up to them. There was a low brick fireplace, full of fire, an old blue Turkish rug, the little oak table with the lamp and the white and blue cloth and the dessert, and Gudrun making coffee in an odd brass coffee maker, and Winifred scalding a little milk in a tiny saucepan. "Have you had coffee?" said Gudrun. "I have, but I'll have some more with you," he replied. "Then you must have it in a glass. There are only 2 cups," said Winifred. "It is the same to me," he said, taking a chair and coming into the charmed circle of the girls. How happy they were, how cozy and glamorous it was with them, in a world of lofty shadows. The outside world, in which he had been transacting funeral business all the day, was completely wiped out. In an instant he snuffed glamour and magic. They had all their things very dainty, 2 odd and lovely little cups, scarlet and solid gilt, and a little black jug with scarlet discs, and the curious coffee machine, whose spirit flame flowed steadily, almost invisibly. There was the effect of rather sinister richness, in which Gerald at once escaped himself. They all sat down, and Gudrun carefully poured out the coffee. "Will you have milk?" she asked calmly, yet nervously poising the little black jug with its big reds. She was always so completely controlled, yet so bitterly nervous. "No, I won't," he replied. So, with a curious humility, she placed him the little cup of coffee and herself took the awkward tumbler. She seemed to want to serve him. "Why don't you give me the glass? It is so clumsy for you," he said. He would much rather have had it and seen her daintily served. But she was silent, pleased with the disparity, with her self-abasement. "You are quite en ménage," he said.
Yes.
"We aren't really at home to visitors," said Winifred.
You're not?
"Then I'm an intruder." For once he felt his conventional dress was out of place. He was an outsider. Gudrun was very quiet. She did not feel drawn to talk to him. At this stage, silence was best, or mere light words. It was best to leave serious things aside. So they talked gaily and lightly, till they heard the man below lead out the horse and call it to back into the dog cart that was to take Gudrun home. So she put on her things and shook hands with Gerald, without once meeting his eyes. And she was gone. The funeral was detestable. Afterwards, at the tea table, the daughters kept saying, "He was a good father to us, the best father in the world, or else we shan't easily find another man as good as father was." Gerald acquiesced in all this. It was the right conventional attitude, and as far as the world went, he believed in the conventions. He took it as a matter of course. But Winifred hated everything, and hid in the studio, and cried her heart out, and wished Gudrun would come. Luckily, everybody was going away. The Krishes never stayed long at home. By dinner time, Gerald was left quite alone. Even Winifred was carried off to London for a few days with her sister Laura. But when Gerald was really left alone, he could not bear it. One day passed by, and another, and all the time he was like a man hung in chains over the edge of an abyss. Struggle as he might, he could not turn himself to the solid earth. He could not get footing. He was suspended on the edge of a void, writhing. Whatever he thought of was the abyss. Whether it were friends or strangers, or work or play, it all showed him only the same bottomless void in which his heart swung perishing. There was no escape, there was nothing to grasp hold of. He must writhe on the edge of the chasm, suspended in chains of invisible physical life. At first he was quiet. He kept still, expecting the extremity to pass away, expecting to find himself released into the world of the living after this extremity of penance. But it did not pass, and a crisis gained upon him. As the evening of the 3rd day came on, his heart rang with fear. He could not bear another night. Another night was coming on. For another night, he was to be suspended in chain of physical life, over the bottomless pit of nothingness. And he could not bear it. He could not bear it. He was frightened deeply and coldly, frightened in his soul. He did not believe in his own strength anymore. He could not fall into this infinite void and rise again. If he fell, he would be gone forever. He must withdraw. He must seek reinforcements. He did not believe in his own single self any further than this. After dinner, faced with the ultimate experience of his own nothingness, he turned aside. He pulled on his boots, put on his coat, and set out to walk in the night. It was dark and misty. He went through the wood, stumbling and feeling his way to the mill. Birkin was away. Good, he was half glad. He turned up the hill and stumbled blindly over the wild slopes, having lost the path in the complete darkness. It was boring. Where was he going? No matter. He stumbled on till he came to a path again. Then he went on through another wood. His mind became dark. He went on automatically. Without thought or sensation, he stumbled unevenly on, out into the open again, fumbling for stiles, losing the path, and going along the hedges of the fields till he came to the outlet. And at last he came to the high road. It had distracted him to struggle blindly through the maze of darkness. But now he must take a direction. And he did not even know where he was. But he must take a direction now. Nothing would be resolved by merely walking away. He had to take a direction. He stood still on the road that was high in the utterly dark night, and he did not know where he was. It was a strange sensation, his heart beating, and ringed round with the utterly unknown darkness.
So he stood for some time.
Then he heard footsteps and saw a small, swinging light. He immediately went towards this. It was a miner. "Can you tell me," he said, "where this road goes?" "Road? Aye, it goes to Watmore." "Watmore? Oh, thank you. That's right. I thought I was wrong. Good night." "Good night," replied the broad voice of the miner. Gerald guessed where he was. At least, when he came to Watmore, he would know. He was glad to be on a high road. He walked forward as in a sleep of decision. That was Watmore village. Yes, the King's Head, and there the Hall gates. He descended the steep hill, almost running. Winding through the hollow, he passed the grammar school and came to Wiley Green Church,
The churchyard.
He halted. Then, in another moment, he had clambered up the wall and was going among the graves. Even in this darkness, he could see the heaped pallor of old white flowers at his feet. This then was the grave. He stooped down. The flowers were cold and clammy. There was a raw scent of chrysanthemums and tuberoses, deadened. He felt the clay beneath and shrank. It was so horribly cold and sticky. He stood away in revulsion. Here was one center then, here in the complete darkness beside the unseen, raw grave. But there was nothing for him here. No, he had nothing to stay here for. He felt as if some of the clay were sticking cold and unclean on his heart. No, enough of this. Where then? Home? Never. It was no use going there. That was less than no use. It could not be done. There was somewhere else to go. Where? A dangerous resolve formed in his heart, like a fixed idea. There was Gudrun, she would be safe in her home. But he could get at her. He would get at her. He would not go back tonight till he had come to her, if it cost him his life. He staked his all on this throw. He set off walking straight across the fields towards Beldover. It was so dark, nobody could ever see him. His feet were wet and cold, heavy with clay. But he went on persistently, like a wind, straight forward, as if to his fate. There were great gaps in his consciousness. He was conscious that he was at Winthorpe Hamlet, but quite unconscious how he had got there. And then, as in a dream, he was in the long street of Beldover, with its street lamps. There was a noise of voices, and of a door shutting loudly, and being barred, and of men talking in the night. The Lord Nelson had just closed, and the drinkers were going home. He had better ask one of these where she lived, for he did not know the side streets at all. "Can you tell me where Somerset Drive is?" he asked of one of the uneven men. "Where what?" replied the tipsy miner's voice. "Somerset Drive. Somerset Drive. I've heard such a place, but I couldn't for my life say where it is. Who might you be wanting?" "Mr. Brangwen. William Brangwen." "William Brangwen? Who teaches at the grammar school at Wiley Green. His daughter teaches there too." Oh, Brangwen. Now I've got you. Of course, William Brangwen. Yes, he's got two lasses as teachers, aside hisself. That's him. Why, certainly I know where he lives. Back your life I do. What place do they see it? Somerset Drive, repeated Gerald patiently. He knew his own colliers fairly well. Somerset Drive, for certain, said the collier, swinging his arm as if catching something up. Somerset Drive, I couldn't for my life lay hold, the locality, the place. I know the place, to be sure I do. He turned unsteadily on his feet and pointed up the dark, nigh-deserted road. You go up there and you tie to first and on your left. That side, past Withams's Tuffy shop. I know, said Gerald.
Aye.
You go down a bit, past weird Waterman Lives, and then Somerset Drive, as they see it, branches off on T right-hand side, and there's now but 3 houses in it, no more than 3, I believe, and I'm amos certain as theirs is the last 03, you see. Thank you very much, said Gerald. Good night. And he started off, leaving the tipsy man there standing rooted. Gerald went past the dark shops and houses, most of them sleeping now, and twisted round to the little blind road that ended on a field of darkness. He slowed down as he neared his goal, not knowing how he should proceed. What if the house were closed in darkness? But it was not. He saw a big lighted window and heard voices, then a gate banged. His quick ears caught the sound of Birkin's voice. His keen eyes made out Birkin, with Ursula standing in a pale dress on the step of the garden path. Then Ursula stepped down and came along the road, holding Birkin's arm. Gerald went across into the darkness, and they dawdled past him, talking happily, Birkin's voice low, Ursula's high and distinct. Gerald went quickly to the house. The blinds were drawn before the big, lighted window of the dining room. Looking up the path at the side, he could see the door left open, shedding a soft, colored light from the hall lamp. He went quickly and silently up the path and looked up into the hall. There were pictures on the walls and the antlers of a stag and the stairs going up on one side, and just near the foot of the stairs the half-open door of the dining room. With heart drawn fine, Gerald stepped into the hall, whose floor was of colored tiles, went quickly and looked into the large, pleasant room. In a chair by the fire, the father sat asleep, his head tilted back against the side of the big oak chimney piece, his ruddy face seen foreshortened, the nostrils open, the mouth fallen a little. It would take the merest sound to wake him. Gerald stood a second suspended. He glanced down the passage behind him. It was all dark. Again he was suspended. Then he went swiftly upstairs. His senses were so finely, almost supernaturally keen, that he seemed to cast his own will over the half-unconscious house. He came to the first landing. There he stood, scarcely breathing. Again, corresponding to the door below, there was a door again. That would be the mother's room. He could hear her moving about in the candlelight. She would be expecting her husband to come up. He looked along the dark landing. Then, silently, on infinitely careful feet, he went along the passage, feeling the wall with the extreme tips of his fingers. There was a door. He stood and listened. He could hear 2 people's breathing.
It was not that.
He went stealthily forward. There was another door, slightly open. The room was in darkness, empty. Then there was the bathroom. He could smell the soap and the heat. Then, at the end, another bedroom, one soft breathing. This was she. With an almost occult carefulness, he turned the door handle and opened the door an inch. It creaked slightly. Then he opened it another inch, then another. His heart did not beat. He seemed to create a silence about himself, an obliviousness. He was in the room. Still the sleeper breathed softly. It was very dark. He felt his way forward inch by inch, with his feet and hands. He touched the bed. He could hear the sleeper. He drew nearer, bending close, as if his eyes would disclose whatever there was. And then, very near to his face, to his fear, he saw the round, dark head of a boy. He recovered, turned round, saw the door ajar, a faint light revealed, and he retreated swiftly, drew the door to without fastening it, and passed rapidly down the passage. At the head of the stairs, he hesitated. There was still time to flee, but it was unthinkable. He would maintain his will. He turned past the door of the parental bedroom like a shadow and was climbing the second flight of stairs. They creaked under his weight. It was exasperating. Ah, what disaster! If the mother's door opened just beneath him, and she saw him, it would have to be if it were so. He held the controls still. He was not quite up these stairs when he heard a quick running of feet below. The outer door was closed and locked. He heard Ursula's voice, then the father's sleepy exclamation. He pressed on swiftly to the upper landing. Again, a door was ajar. A room was empty. Feeling his way forward, with the tips of his fingers, traveling rapidly, like a blind man, anxious lest Ursula should come upstairs, he found another door. There, with his preternaturally fine sense alert, he listened. He heard someone moving in bed. This would be she. Softly now, like one who has only one sense, the tactile sense, he turned the latch. It clicked. He held still. The bedclothes rustled. His heart did not beat. Then again he drew the latch back and very gently pushed the door. It made a sticking noise as it gave. "Ursula," said Gudrun's voice, frightened. He quickly opened the door and pushed it behind him. "Is it you, Ursula?" came Gudrun's frightened voice. He heard her sitting up in bed. In another moment she would scream. "No, it's me," he said, feeling his way towards her. "It is I, Gerald." She sat motionless in her bed in sheer astonishment. She was too astonished, too much taken by surprise, even to be afraid. "Gerald," she echoed, in blank amazement. He had found his way to the bed, and his outstretched hand touched her warm breast blindly. She shrank away. "Let me make a light," she said, springing out. He stood perfectly motionless. He heard her touch the matchbox. He heard her fingers in their movement. Then he saw her in the light of a match, which she held to the candle. The light rose in the room, then sank to a small dimness as the flames sank down on the candle, before it mounted again. She looked at him, as he stood near the other side of the bed. His cap was pulled low over his brow. His black overcoat was buttoned close up to his chin. His face was strange and luminous. He was inevitable as a supernatural being. When she had seen him, she knew there was something fatal in the situation, and she must accept it. Yet she must challenge him. "How did you come up?" she asked. "I walked up the stairs. The door was open." She looked at him. "I haven't closed this door either," he said. She walked swiftly across the room and closed her door softly and locked it. Then she came back. She was wonderful, with startled eyes and flushed cheeks, and her plait of hair rather short and thick down her back, and her long, fine white nightdress falling to her feet. She saw that his boots were all clay. Even his trousers were plastered with clay. And she wondered if he had made footprints all the way up. He was a very strange figure, standing in her bedroom, near the tossed bed. "Why have you come?" she asked, almost querulous. "I wanted to," he replied. And this she could see from his face. It was fate. "You are so muddy," she said, in distaste but gently. He looked down at his feet. "I was walking in the dark," he replied, but he felt vividly elated. There was a pause. He stood on one side of the tumbled bed, she on the other. He did not even take his cap from his brows. "And what do you want of me?" she challenged. He looked aside and did not answer. Save for the extreme beauty and mystic attractiveness of this distinct, strange face, she would have sent him away. But his face was too wonderful and undiscovered to her. It fascinated her with the fascination of pure beauty, cast a spell on her, like nostalgia and ache. "What do you want of me?" she repeated in an estranged voice. He pulled off his cap in a movement of dream liberation and went across to her. But he could not touch her because she stood barefoot in her nightdress, and he was muddy and damp. Her eyes, wide and large and wondering, watched him and asked him the ultimate question. "I came because I must," he said. "Why do you ask?" She looked at him in doubt and wonder. "I must ask," she said. He shook his head slightly. "There is no answer," he replied, with strange vacancy. There was about him a curious and almost godlike air of simplicity and native directness. He reminded her of an apparition, the young Hermes. "But why did you come to me?" she persisted. "Because it has to be so. If there weren't you in the world, then I shouldn't be in the world either." She stood looking at him, with large, wide, wondering, stricken eyes. His eyes were looking steadily into hers all the time, and he seemed fixed in an odd supernatural steadfastness. She sighed. She was lost now. She had no choice. "Won't you take off your boots?" she said. "They must be wet." He dropped his cap on a chair, unbuttoned his overcoat, lifting up his chin to unfasten the throat buttons. His short, keen hair was ruffled. He was so beautifully blonde, like wheat. He pulled off his overcoat. Quickly, he pulled off his jacket, pulled loose his black tie, and was unfastening his studs, which were headed each with a pearl. She listened, watching, hoping no one would hear the starched linen crackle. It seemed to snap like pistol shots. He had come for vindication. She let him hold her in his arms, clasp her close against him. He found in her an infinite relief. Into her he poured all his pent-up darkness and corrosive death, and he was whole again. It was wonderful, marvelous, it was a miracle. This was the ever-recurrent miracle of his life, at the knowledge of which he was lost in an ecstasy of relief and wonder. And she, subject, received him as a vessel filled with his bitter potion of death. She had no power at this crisis to resist. The terrible frictional violence of death filled her, and she received it in an ecstasy of subjection, in throes of acute, violent sensation. As he drew nearer to her, he plunged deeper into her enveloping soft warmth, a wonderful creative heat that penetrated his veins and gave him life again. He felt himself dissolving and sinking to rest in the bath of her living strength. It seemed as if her heart and her breast were a second unconquerable sun, into the glow and creative strength of which he plunged further and further. All his veins, that were murdered and lacerated, healed softly as life came pulsing in, stealing invisibly into him, as if it were the all-powerful effluence of the sun. His blood, which seemed to have been drawn back into death, came ebbing on the return, surely, beautifully, powerfully. He felt his limbs growing fuller and flexible with life. His body gained an unknown strength. He was a man again, strong and rounded. And he was a child, so soothed and restored and full of gratitude. And she was the great bath of life. He worshipped her. Mother and substance of all life she was. And he, child and man, received of her and was made whole. His pure body was almost killed, but the miraculous, soft effluence of her breast suffused over him, over his seared, damaged brain, like a healing lymph, like a soft, soothing flow of life itself, perfect as if he were bathed in the womb again. His brain was hurt, seared, the tissue was as if destroyed. He had not known how hurt he was, how his tissue, the very tissue of his brain, was damaged by the corrosive flood of death. Now, as the healing lymph of her effluence flowed through him, he knew how destroyed he was, like a plant whose tissue is burst from inwards by a frost. He buried his small, hard head between her breasts and pressed her breasts against him with his hands. And she with quivering hands pressed his head against her, as he lay suffused out, and she lay fully conscious. The lovely creative warmth flooded through him like a sleep of fecundity within the womb. Ah, if only she would grant him the flow of this living effluence, he would be restored, he would be complete again. He was afraid she would deny him before it was finished. Like a child at the breast, he cleaved intensely to her, and she could not put him away. And his seared, ruined membrane relaxed, softened. That which was seared and stiff and blasted yielded again, became soft and flexible, palpitating with new life. He was infinitely grateful, as to God, or as an infant is at its mother's breast. He was glad and grateful like a delirium, as he felt his own wholeness come over him again, as he felt the full, unutterable sleep coming over him, the sleep of complete exhaustion and restoration. But Gudrun lay wide awake, destroyed into perfect consciousness. She lay motionless, with wide eyes staring motionless into the darkness, whilst he was sunk away in sleep, his arms round her. She seemed to be hearing waves break on a hidden shore, long, slow, gloomy waves, breaking with the rhythm of fate, so monotonously that it seemed eternal. This endless breaking of slow, sullen waves of fate held her life a possession, whilst she lay with dark, wide eyes looking into the darkness. She could see so far as eternity, yet she saw nothing. She was suspended in perfect consciousness. And of what was she conscious? This mood of extremity, when she lay staring into eternity, utterly suspended and conscious of everything, to the last limits, passed and left her uneasy. She had lain so long motionless. She moved. She became self-conscious. She wanted to look at him, to see him, but she dared not make a light because she knew he would wake, and she did not want to break his perfect sleep that she knew he had got of her. She disengaged herself, softly, and rose up a little to look at him. There was a faint light, it seemed to her, in the room. She could just distinguish his features, as he slept the perfect sleep. In this darkness, she seemed to see him so distinctly, but he was far off in another world. Ah, she could shriek with torment. He was so far off and perfected in another world. She seemed to look at him as at a pebble far away under clear, dark water. And here was she, left with all the anguish of consciousness, whilst he was sunk deep into the other element of mindless, remote, living shadow gleam. He was beautiful, far off, and perfected. They would never be together. This awful, inhuman distance which would always be interposed between her and the other being. There was nothing to do but to lie still and endure. She felt an overwhelming tenderness for him and a dark understirring of jealous hatred that he should lie so perfect and immune in an other world, whilst she was tormented with violent wakefulness, cast out in the outer darkness. She lay in intense and vivid consciousness, an exhausting superconsciousness. The church clock struck the hours, it seemed to her, in quick succession. She heard them distinctly in the tension of her vivid consciousness. And he slept as if time were one moment, unchanging and unmoving. She was exhausted, wearied. Yet she must continue in this state of violent active superconsciousness. She was conscious of everything, her childhood, her girlhood, all the forgotten incidents, all the unrealized influences, and all the happenings she had not understood, pertaining to herself, to her family, to her friends, her lovers, her acquaintances, everybody. It was as if she drew a glittering rope of knowledge out of the sea of darkness, drew and drew and drew it out of the fathomless depths of the past, and still it did not come to an end. There was no end to it. She must haul and haul at the rope of glittering consciousness, pull it out phosphorescent from the endless depths of the unconsciousness, till she was weary, aching, exhausted, and fit to break, and yet she had not done. Ah, if only she might wake him. She turned uneasily. When could she rouse him and send him away? When could she disturb him? And she relapsed into her activity of automatic consciousness. That would never end. But the time was drawing near when she could wake him. It was like a release. The clock had struck 4, outside in the night. Thank God the night had passed almost away. At 5 he must go, and she would be released. Then she could relax and fill her own place. Now she was driven up against his perfect sleeping motion like a knife, white hot on a grindstone. There was something monstrous about him, about his juxtaposition against her. The last hour was the longest, and yet, at last it passed. Her heart leapt with relief. Yes, there was the slow, strong stroke of the church clock. At last, after this night of eternity, she waited to catch each slow, fatal reverberation. 3, 4, 5. There, it was finished. A weight rolled off her. She raised herself, leaned over him tenderly, and kissed him. She was sad to wake him. After a few moments, she kissed him again, but he did not stir. The darling, he was so deep in sleep. What a shame to take him out of it. She let him lie a little longer, but he must go, he must really go. With full over-tenderness, she took his face between her hands and kissed his eyes. The eyes opened. He remained motionless, looking at her. Her heart stood still. To hide her face from his dreadful opened eyes, in the darkness, she bent down and kissed him, whispering, "You must go, my love." but she was sick with terror, sick. He put his arms round her. Her heart sank. "But you must go, my love. It's late." "What time is it?" he said. Strange, his man's voice. She quivered. It was an intolerable oppression to her. "Past 5 o'clock," she said. But he only closed his arms round her again. Her heart cried within her in torture. She disengaged herself firmly. "You really must go," she said. "Not for a minute," he said. She lay still, nestling against him, but unyielding. "Not for a minute," he repeated, clasping her closer. "Yes," she said, unyielding. "I'm afraid if you stay any longer." There was a certain coldness in her voice that made him release her, and she broke away, rose, and lit the candle. That then was the end. He got up. He was warm and full of life and desire. Yet he felt a little bit ashamed, humiliated, putting on his clothes before her, in the candlelight. For he felt revealed, exposed to her, at a time when she was in some way against him.
It was all very difficult to understand.
He dressed himself quickly, without collar or tie. Still he felt full and complete, perfected. She thought it humiliating to see a man dressing. The ridiculous shirt, the ridiculous trousers and braces. But again, an idea saved her. "It is like a workman getting up to go to work," thought Gudrun. "And I am like a workman's wife." But an ache like nausea was upon her, a nausea of him.
He pushed his collar and tie into his overcoat pocket. Then he sat down and pulled on his boots. They were sodden, as were his socks and trouser bottoms. But he himself was quick and warm.
"Perhaps you ought to have put your boots on downstairs," she said. At once, without answering, he pulled them off again, and stood holding them in his hand. She had thrust her feet into slippers, and flung a loose robe round her. She was ready. She looked at him as he stood waiting, his black coat buttoned to the chin, his cap pulled down, his boots in his hand. And the passionate, almost hateful fascination revived in her for a moment. It was not exhausted. His face was so warm-looking, wide-eyed, and full of newness, so perfect. She felt old. She went to him heavily, to be kissed. He kissed her quickly. She wished his warm, expressionless beauty did not so fatally put a spell on her, compel her and subjugate her. It was a burden upon her, that she resented, but could not escape. Yet when she looked at his straight man's brows, and at his rather small, well-shaped nose, and at his blue, indifferent eyes, she knew her passion for him was not yet satisfied, perhaps never could be satisfied. Only now she was weary, with an ache like nausea. She wanted him gone. They went downstairs quickly. It seemed they made a prodigious noise. He followed her as, wrapped in her vivid green wrap, she preceded him with the light. She suffered badly with fear, lest her people should be roused. He hardly cared. He did not care now who knew, and she hated this in him. One must be cautious. One must preserve oneself. She led the way to the kitchen. It was neat and tidy, as the woman had left it. He looked up at the clock. 20 minutes past 5 then, he sat down on a chair to put on his boots. She waited, watching his every movement. She wanted it to be over. It was a great nervous strain on her. He stood up. She unbolted the back door and looked out. A cold, raw night, not yet dawn, with a piece of a moon in the vague sky. She was glad she need not go out. "Goodbye then," he murmured. "I'll come to the gate," she said. And again she hurried on in front, to warn him of the steps. And at the gate, once more she stood on the step whilst he stood below her. "Goodbye," she whispered. He kissed her dutifully, and turned away. She suffered torments hearing his firm tread going so distinctly down the road. The insensitiveness of that firm tread. She closed the gate, and crept quickly and noiselessly back to bed. When she was in her room, and the door closed, and all safe, she breathed freely, and a great weight fell off her. She nestled down in bed, in the groove his body had made, in the warmth he had left, and excited, worn out, yet still satisfied, she fell soon into a deep, heavy sleep. Gerald walked quickly through the raw darkness of the coming dawn. He met nobody. His mind was beautifully still and thoughtless, like a still pool, and his body full and warm and rich. He went quickly along towards Shortlands in a grateful self-sufficiency. XXV, marriage or not, the Brangwen family was going to move from Beldover. It was necessary now for the father to be in town. Buchan had taken out a marriage license, yet Ursula deferred from day to day. She would not fix any definite time. She still wavered. Her month's notice to leave the grammar school was in its 3rd week. Christmas was not far off. Gerald waited for the Ursula Buchan marriage. It was something crucial to him. "Shall we make it a double-barreled affair?" he said to Buchan one day. "Who for the second shot?" asked Buchan. "Gudrun and me," said Gerald, the venturesome twinkle in his eyes. Buchan looked at him steadily, as if somewhat taken aback. "Serious or joking?" he asked. "Oh, serious. Shall Gudrun and I rush in along with you?" "Do by all means," said Buchan. "I didn't know you'd got that length." "What length?" said Gerald, looking at the other man and laughing. "Oh yes, we've gone all the lengths. There remains to put it on a broad social basis and to achieve a high moral purpose," said Buchan. "Something like that. The length and breadth and height of it," replied Gerald, smiling. "Oh well," said Buchan, "it's a very admirable step to take, I should say." Gerald looked at him closely. "Why aren't you enthusiastic?" he asked. "I thought you were such dead nuts on marriage." Buchan lifted his shoulders. "One might as well be dead nuts on noses. There are all sorts of noses, snub and otherwise." Gerald laughed. "And all sorts of marriage, also snub and otherwise," he said. "That's it." "And you think if I marry, it will be snub?" asked Gerald quizzically, his head a little on one side. Buchan laughed quickly. "How do I know what it will be?" he said. "Don't lambaste me with my own parallels." Gerald pondered a while. "But I should like to know your opinion exactly," he said. "On your marriage or marrying?" "Why should you want my opinion? I've got no opinions. I'm not interested in legal marriage one way or another. It's a mere question of convenience." Still, Gerald watched him closely. "More than that, I think," he said seriously. "However you may be bored by the ethics of marriage, yet really to marry, in one's own personal case, is something critical, final." "You mean there is something final in going to the registrar with a woman?" "If you're coming back with her, I do," said Gerald. "It is in some way irrevocable." "Yes, I agree," said Buchan. "No matter how one regards legal marriage, yet to enter into the married state, in one's own personal instance, is final." "I believe it is," said Buchan somewhere. "The question remains then, should one do it?" said Gerald. Buchan watched him narrowly, with amused eyes. "You are like Lord Bacon, Gerald," he said. "You argue it like a lawyer, or like Hamlet's to be or not to be. If I were you, I would not marry, but ask Gudrun, not me. You're not marrying me, are you?" Gerald did not heed the latter part of this speech. "Yes," he said, "one must consider it coldly. It is something critical. One comes to the point where one must take a step in one direction or another, and marriage is one direction." "And what is the other?" asked Buchan quickly. Gerald looked up at him with hot, strangely conscious eyes that the other man could not understand. "I can't say," he replied. "If I knew that." He moved uneasily on his feet and did not finish. "You mean if you knew the alternative?" asked Buchan. "And since you don't know it, marriage is a peace-aller." Gerald looked up at Buchan with the same hot, constrained eyes. "One does have the feeling that marriage is a peace-aller," he admitted. "Then don't do it," said Buchan. "I tell you," he went on, "the same as I've said before, marriage in the old sense seems to me repulsive.
Égoïsme à deux is nothing to it.
It's a sort of tacit hunting in couples. The world all in couples, each couple in its own little house, watching its own little interests and stewing in its own little privacy. It's the most repulsive thing on earth." "I quite agree," said Gerald. "There's something inferior about it. But as I say, what's the alternative? One should avoid this home instinct. It's not an instinct, it's a habit of cowardliness. One should never have a home." "I agree, really," said Gerald. "But there's no alternative. We've got to find one." I do believe in a permanent union between a man and a woman. Chopping about is merely an exhaustive process. But a permanent relation between a man and a woman isn't the last word. It certainly isn't. Quite, said Gerald. In fact, said Birkin, because the relation between man and woman is made the supreme and exclusive relationship, that's where all the tightness and meanness and insufficiency comes in. Yes, I believe you, said Gerald. You've got to take down the love and marriage ideal from its pedestal. We want something broader. I believe in the additional perfect relationship between man and man, additional to marriage. I can never see how they can be the same, said Gerald. Not the same, but equally important, equally creative, equally sacred, if you like. I know, said Gerald. You believe something like that. Only I can't feel it, you see. He put his hand on Birkin's arm with a sort of deprecating affection, and he smiled as if triumphantly. He was ready to be doomed. Marriage was like a doom to him. He was willing to condemn himself in marriage, to become like a convict condemned to the mines of the underworld, living no life in the sun, but having a dreadful subterranean activity. He was willing to accept this, and marriage was the seal of his condemnation. He was willing to be sealed thus in the underworld, like a soul damned but living forever in damnation. But he would not make any pure relationship with any other soul. He could not. Marriage was not the committing of himself into a relationship with Gudrun. It was a committing of himself in acceptance of the established world. He would accept the established order, in which he did not livingly believe, and then he would retreat to the underworld for his life. This he would do. The other way was to accept Rupert's offer of alliance, to enter into the bond of pure trust and love with the other man, and then subsequently with the woman. If he pledged himself with the man, he would later be able to pledge himself with the woman, not merely in legal marriage, but in absolute, mystic marriage. Yet he could not accept the offer. There was a numbness upon him, a numbness either of unborn, absent volition, or of atrophy. Perhaps it was the absence of volition, for he was strangely elated at Rupert's offer. Yet he was still more glad to reject it, not to be committed. XXVI, a chair. There was a jumble market every Monday afternoon in the old marketplace in town. Ursula and Birkin strayed down there one afternoon. They had been talking of furniture, and they wanted to see if there was any fragment they would like to buy, amid the heaps of rubbish collected on the cobblestones. The old market square was not very large, a mere bare patch of granite sets, usually with a few fruit stalls under a wall. It was in a poor quarter of the town. Meager houses stood down one side. There was a hosiery factory, a great blank with myriad oblong windows. At the end, a street of little shops with flagstone pavement down the other side, and, for a crowning monument, the public baths of new red brick with a clock tower. The people who moved about seemed stumpy and sordid. The air seemed to smell rather dirty. There was a sense of many mean streets ramifying off into warrens of meanness. Now and again, a great chocolate and yellow tramcar ground round a difficult bend under the hosiery factory. Ursula was superficially thrilled when she found herself out among the common people, in the jumbled place piled with old bedding, heaps of old iron, shabby crockery in pale lots, muffled lots of unthinkable clothing. She and Birkin went unwillingly down the narrow aisle between the rusty wares. He was looking at the goods, she at the people. She excitedly watched a young woman who was going to have a baby and who was turning over a mattress and making a young man, down at heel and dejected, feel it also. So secretive and active and anxious the young woman seemed, so reluctant, slinking the young man. He was going to marry her because she was having a child. When they had felt the mattress, the young woman asked the old man seated on a stool among his wares how much it was. He told her, and she turned to the young man. The latter was ashamed and self-conscious. He turned his face away, though he left his body standing there, and muttered aside. And again the woman anxiously and actively fingered the mattress and added up in her mind and bargained with the old, unclean man. All the while, the young man stood by, shamefaced and down at heel, submitting. "Look," said Birkin, "there is a pretty chair." "Charming," cried Ursula. "Oh, charming." It was an armchair of simple wood, probably birch, but of such fine delicacy of grace. Standing there on the sordid stones, it almost brought tears to the eyes. It was square in shape, of the purest, slender lines, and 4 short lines of wood in the back that reminded Ursula of harp strings. "It was once," said Birkin, "gilded, and it had a cane seat. Somebody has nailed this wooden seat in. Look, here is a trifle of the red that underlay the gilt. The rest is all black, except where the wood is worn pure and glossy. It is the fine unity of the lines that is so attractive. Look how they run and meet and counteract. But of course the wooden seat is wrong. It destroys the perfect lightness and unity in tension the cane gave. I like it though." "Ah yes," said Ursula, "so do I." "How much is it?" Birkin asked the man. 10 shillings. "And you will send it?" It was bought. "So beautiful, so pure," Birkin said. "It almost breaks my heart." They walked along between the heaps of rubbish. My beloved country, it had something to express even when it made that chair. "And hasn't it now?" asked Ursula. She was always angry when he took this tone. "No, it hasn't. When I see that clear, beautiful chair, and I think of England, even Jane Austen's England, it had living thoughts to unfold even then, and pure happiness in unfolding them. And now, we can only fish among the rubbish heaps for the remnants of their old expression. There is no production in us now, only sordid and foul mechanicalness." "It isn't true," cried Ursula. "Why must you always praise the past at the expense of the present? Really, I don't think so much of Jane Austen's England. It was materialistic enough, if you like." "It could afford to be materialistic," said Birkin, "because it had the power to be something other, which we haven't. We are materialistic because we haven't the power to be anything else. Try as we may, we can't bring off anything but materialism. Mechanism, the very soul of materialism." Ursula was subdued into angry silence. She did not heed what he said. She was rebelling against something else. "And I hate your past. I'm sick of it," she cried. "I believe I even hate that old chair, though it is beautiful. It isn't my sort of beauty. I wish it had been smashed up when its day was over, not left to preach the beloved past to us. I'm sick of the beloved past." "Not so sick as I am of the accursed present," he said. "Yes, just the same. I hate the present, but I don't want the past to take its place. I don't want that old chair." He was rather angry for a moment. Then he looked at the sky shining beyond the tower of the public baths, and he seemed to get over it all. He laughed. "All right," he said, "then let us not have it. I'm sick of it all, too. At any rate, one can't go on living on the old bones of beauty." "One can't," she cried. "I don't want old things." "The truth is, we don't want things at all," he replied. "The thought of a house and furniture of my own is hateful to me." This startled her for a moment. Then she replied, "So, it is to me, but one must live somewhere." "Not somewhere, anywhere," he said. "One should just live anywhere, not have a definite place." "I don't want a definite place. As soon as you get a room and it is complete, you want to run from it. Now my rooms at the mill are quite complete, I want them at the bottom of the sea. It is a horrible tyranny of a fixed milieu, where each piece of furniture is a commandment stone." She clung to his arm as they walked away from the market. "But what are we going to do?" she said. "We must live somehow. And I do want some beauty in my surroundings. I want a sort of natural grandeur, even splendor. You'll never get it in houses and furniture, or even clothes. Houses and furniture and clothes, they are all terms of an old base world, a detestable society of man. And if you have a Tudor house and old, beautiful furniture, it is only the past perpetuated on top of you. Horrible. And if you have a perfect modern house done for you by Porret, it is something else perpetuated on top of you. It is all horrible. It is all possessions, bullying you and turning you into a generalization. You have to be like Rodin, Michelangelo, and leave a piece of raw rock unfinished to your figure. You must leave your surroundings sketchy unfinished, so that you are never contained, never confined, never dominated from the outside." She stood in the street contemplating. And we are never to have a complete place of our own, never a home, she said. Pray God. In this world, no, he answered. But there's only this world, she objected. He spread out his hands with a gesture of indifference. Meanwhile, then, we'll avoid having things of our own, he said. But you've just bought a chair, she said. I can tell the man I don't want it, he replied. She pondered again. Then a queer little movement twitched her face. No, she said. We don't want it. I'm sick of old things. New ones as well, he said. They retraced their steps. There, in front of some furniture, stood the young couple, the woman who was going to have a baby, and the narrow-faced youth. She was fair, rather short, stout. He was of medium height, attractively built. His dark hair fell sideways over his brow, from under his cap. He stood strangely aloof, like one of the damned. Let us give it to them, whispered Ursula. Look, they are getting a home together. I won't aid abet them in it, he said petulantly, instantly sympathizing with the aloof, furtive youth against the active, procreant female. Oh yes, cried Ursula. It's right for them. There's nothing else for them. Very well, said Birkin. You offer it to them. I'll watch. Ursula went rather nervously to the young couple who were discussing an iron washstand. Or rather, the man was glancing furtively and wonderingly, like a prisoner, at the abominable article, whilst the woman was arguing. We bought a chair, said Ursula, and we don't want it. Would you have it? We should be glad if you would. The young couple looked round at her, not believing that she could be addressing them. Would you care for it? Repeated Ursula. It's really very pretty, but, she smiled rather dazzlingly. The young couple only stared at her and looked significantly at each other to know what to do, and the man curiously obliterated himself as if he could make himself invisible as a rat can. We wanted to give it to you, explained Ursula, now overcome with confusion and dread of them. She was attracted by the young man. He was a still, mindless creature, hardly a man at all, a creature that the towns have produced, strangely purebred and fine in one sense, furtive, quick, subtle. His lashes were dark and long and fine over his eyes, that had no mind in them, only a dreadful kind of subject, inward consciousness, glazed and dark. His dark brows and all his lines were finely drawn. He would be a dreadful but wonderful lover to a woman, so marvelously contributed. His legs would be marvelously subtle and alive. Under the shapeless trousers, he had some of the fineness and stillness and silkiness of a dark-eyed, silent rat. Ursula had apprehended him with a fine frisson of attraction. The full-built woman was staring offensively. Again, Ursula forgot him. Won't you have the chair? She said. The man looked at her with a sideways look of appreciation, yet far off, almost insolent. The woman drew herself up. There was a certain costermonger richness about her. She did not know what Ursula was after. She was on her guard, hostile. Birkin approached, smiling wickedly at seeing Ursula so nonplussed and frightened. What's the matter? He said, smiling. His eyelids had dropped slightly. There was about him the same suggestive, mocking secrecy that was in the bearing of the two city creatures. The man jerked his head a little on one side, indicating Ursula, and said, with curious, amiable, jeering warmth, "What she warn't." An odd smile writhed his lips. Birkin looked at him from under his slack, ironical eyelids. "To give you a chair, that with the label on it," he said, pointing. The man looked at the object indicated. There was a curious hostility in male, outlawed understanding between the two men. "What's she warn't to give it us for, governor?" he replied, in a tone of free intimacy that insulted Ursula. "Thought you'd like it. It's a pretty chair. We bought it and don't want it." "No need for you to have it. Don't be frightened," said Birkin with a wry smile. The man glanced up at him, half inimical, half recognizing. "Why don't you want it for yourselves if you've just bought it?" asked the woman coolly. "'Tain't good enough for you. Now you've had a look at it. Frightened it's got something in it, Elle." She was looking at Ursula admiringly, but with some resentment. "I never thought of that," said Birkin. "But no, the wood's too thin everywhere." "You see," said Ursula, her face luminous and pleased. "We're just going to get married, and we thought we'd buy things. Then we decided, just now, that we wouldn't have furniture. We'd go abroad." The full-built, slightly blowsy city girl looked at the fine face of the other woman with appreciation. They appreciated each other. The youth stood aside, his face expressionless and timeless, the thin line of the black mustache drawn strangely suggestive over his rather wide, closed mouth. He was impassive, abstract, like some dark, suggestive presence, a gutter presence. "It's all right to be some folks," said the city girl, turning to her own young man. He did not look at her, but he smiled with the lower part of his face, putting his head aside in an odd gesture of assent. His eyes were unchanging, glazed with darkness. "Costs something to change your mind," he said, in an incredibly low accent. "Only 10 shillings this time," said Birkin. The man looked up at him with a grimace of a smile, furtive, unsure. "Cheap at 1/4 quid, governor," he said. "Not like getting divorced." "We're not married yet," said Birkin. No more aren't we," said the young woman loudly. "But we shall be a Saturday." Again she looked at the young man with a determined, protective look, at once overbearing and very gentle. He grinned sicklily, turning away his head. She had got his manhood, but Lord, what did he care? He had a strange furtive pride and slinking singleness. "Good luck to you," said Birkin. "Same to you," said the young woman. Then, rather tentatively, "When's yours coming off, then?" Birkin looked round at Ursula. "It's for the lady to say," he replied. "We go to the registrar the moment she's ready." Ursula laughed, covered with confusion and bewilderment. "No, Yuri," said the young man, grinning suggestive. "Oh, don't break your neck to get there," said the young woman. "It's like when you're dead. You're long time married." The young man turned aside, as if this hit him. "The longer the better. Let us hope," said Birkin. "That's it, governor," said the young man admiringly. "Enjoy it while it lasts. Never whip a dead donkey." "Only when he's shamming dead," said the young woman, looking at her young man with caressive tenderness of authority. "Ah, there's a difference," he said satirically. "What about the chair?" said Birkin. "Yes, all right," said the woman. They trailed off to the dealer, the handsome but abject young fellow hanging a little aside. "That's it," said Birkin. "Will you take it with you, or have the address altered?" "Oh, Fred can carry it. Make him do what he can for the dear old "Make use of him," said Fred, grimly humorous, as he took the chair from the dealer. His movements were graceful, yet curiously abject, slinking. "Here's mother's cozy chair," he said. "Warrants a cushion." And he stood it down on the market stones. "Don't you think it's pretty?" laughed Ursula. "Oh, I do," said the young woman. "Ave, sit in it. You'll wish you'd kept it," said the young man. Ursula promptly sat down in the middle of the marketplace. "Awfully comfortable," she said, "but rather hard. You try it." She invited the young man to a seat, but he turned uncouthly, awkwardly aside, glancing up at her with quick, bright eyes, oddly suggestive, like a quick, live rat. "Don't spoil him," said the young woman. "He's not used to armchairs, he isn't." The young man turned away and said, with averted grin, "Only warrants legs on is." The four parted. The young woman thanked them. "Thank you for the chair. It'll last till it gives way." "Keep it for an ornament," said the young man. Good afternoon," said Ursula and Birkin. "Good luck to you," said the young man, glancing and avoiding Birkin's eyes as he turned aside his head. The two couples went asunder, Ursula clinging to Birkin's arm. When they had gone some distance, she glanced back and saw the young man going beside the full, easy young woman. His trousers sank over his heels. He moved with a sort of slinking evasion, more crushed with odd self-consciousness. Now he had the slim old armchair to carry, his arm over the back, the four fine, square tapering legs swaying perilously near the granite sets of the pavement. And yet he was somewhere indomitable and separate, like a quick, vital rat. He had a queer, subterranean beauty, repulsive too. "How strange they are," said Ursula. "Children of men," he said. "They remind me of Jesus. The meek shall inherit the earth." But they aren't the meek, said Ursula. Yes, I don't know why, but they are, he replied. They waited for the tramcar. Ursula sat on top and looked out on the town. The dusk was just dimming the hollows of crowded houses. And are they going to inherit the earth? She said. Yes, they. Then what are we going to do? She asked. We're not like them, are we? We're not the meek.
No.
We've got to live in the chinks they leave us. How horrible, cried Ursula. I don't want to live in chinks. Don't worry, he said. They are the children of men. They like marketplaces and street corners best. That leaves plenty of chinks. All the world, she said. Ah, no, but some room. The tramcar mounted slowly up the hill, where the ugly winter-gray masses of houses looked like a vision of hell that is cold and angular. They sat and looked. Away in the distance was an angry redness of sunset. It was all cold, somehow small, crowded, and like the end of the world. I don't mind it even then, said Ursula, looking at the repulsiveness of it all. It doesn't concern me. No more it does, he replied, holding her hand. One needn't see. One goes one's way. In my world it is sunny and spacious. It is, my love, isn't it? She cried, hugging near to him on the top of the tramcar so that the other passengers stared at them. And we will wander about on the face of the earth, he said, and we'll look at the world beyond just this bit. There was a long silence. Her face was radiant like gold, as she sat thinking. I don't want to inherit the earth, she said. I don't want to inherit anything. He closed his hand over hers. Neither do I. I want to be disinherited. She clasped his fingers closely. We won't care about anything, she said.
He sat still and laughed.
And we'll be married and have done with them, she added. Again he laughed. It's one way of getting rid of everything, she said, to get married. And one way of accepting the whole world, he added. A whole other world, yes, she said happily. Perhaps there's Gerald and Gudrun, he said. If there is, you see, she said. It's no good our worrying. We can't really alter them, can we?
No, he said.
One has no right to try. Not with the best intentions in the world. Do you try to force them? She asked. Perhaps, he said. Why should I want him to be free, if it isn't his business? She paused for a time. We can't make him happy anyhow, she said. He'd have to be it of himself. I know, he said. But we want other people with us, don't we? Why should we? She asked. I don't know, he said uneasily. One has a hankering after a sort of further fellowship. But why? She insisted. Why should you hanker after other people? Why should you need them? This hit him right on the quick. His brows knitted. Does it end with just our two selves? He asked, tense. Yes, what more do you want? If anybody likes to come along, let them. But why must you run after them? His face was tense and unsatisfied. You see, he said, I always imagine our being really happy with some few other people, a little freedom with people. She pondered for a moment. Yes, one does want that, but it must happen. You can't do anything for it with your will. You always seem to think you can force the flowers to come out. People must love us because they love us. You can't make them. I know, he said, but must one take no steps at all? Must one just go as if one were alone in the world, the only creature in the world? You've got me, she said. Why should you need others? Why must you force people to agree with you? Why can't you be single by yourself, as you are always saying? You try to bully Gerald, as you tried to bully Hermione. You must learn to be alone. And it's so horrid of you. You've got me, and yet you want to force other people to love you as well. You do try to bully them to love you. And even then, you don't want their love. His face was full of real perplexity. Don't I? He said. It's the problem I can't solve. I know I want a perfect and complete relationship with you, and we've nearly got it, we really have. But beyond that, do I want a real, ultimate relationship with Gerald? Do I want a final, almost extra-human relationship with him? A relationship in the ultimate of me and him, or don't I? She looked at him for a long time, with strange bright eyes, but she did not answer. XXVI. Flitting. That evening, Ursula returned home very bright-eyed and wondrous, which irritated her people. Her father came home at supper time, tired after the evening class and the long journey home. Gudrun was reading. The mother sat in silence. Suddenly, Ursula said to the company at large, in a bright voice, "Rupert and I are going to be married tomorrow." Her father turned round, stiffly.